All right, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Monica, and on behalf of the University of Kentucky, welcome to the main stage. So you could say that this next discussion is something near and dear to our hearts, as these novelists will discuss writing complicated love stories. He was born and grew up in rural Kentucky, a recent graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop who now lives in New York. Please welcome Lee Cole. She is the New York Times bestselling author of many novels, including the first official Stranger Things novel, Suspicious Minds. Give a warm welcome to Gwenda Bond. She is an award-winning writer, poet, and playwright who is a member of the graduate faculty at the Naslin Mann Graduate School of Writing at Spalding University. Welcome to the stage, Angela Jackson Brown. And she is the editor-at-large at Writer's Digest, the author of the book club favorites Almost Missed You, Not That I Could Tell, and Forget You Know Me. Join me in welcoming Jessica Strawser.
Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our panel. When the Kentucky Book Fair staff approached me about not just participating on this panel, but moderating it, they acknowledged that, between the four of us, we have a pretty eclectic array of books represented here. Yet one common denominator is they all combine these deep, universal themes with the love story that is central to the narrative. So I'd love to start by touching on what makes each of our titles unique, which is the theme of this panel. Love is complicated. Gwenda, I think your book is the only one here that's actually shelved in romance.
Yeah.
Specifically romantic comedy, but you have a really diverse catalog of prior work.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what drew you into the rom-com space and a bit about your new book?
Well, I've always loved rom-coms, especially screwball rom-coms from the 1940s. But also the classic movies as well, like from the 80s that most people tend to think of. I grew up on all of those. So this is basically like if Dan Brown was a screwball comedy. And it is the Prince of Hell and a girl who's recently graduated from college and is working at her parents' escape room business. And they have to prevent the apocalypse, as you do. And then, so this is not your average hot guy. And then it's a duology, so the sequel is The Date from Hell. And let me just give you a tip. If you're planning on writing a book where the apocalypse is the stakes, maybe don't make that the first book in a series, because then you're like, okay, well, what are we doing for this one? But yeah, these are really fun, and I just they were my play during the pandemic.
Angela, your novel is a historical, but its themes still feel so current to issues we're facing socially and culturally and politically today. What was the first seed of inspiration that became The Light Always Breaks? And, did the core relationship between this working class restaurant owner and this genteel Southern senator, did it play into that idea from the very start?
So when I first started thinking about these characters, I was in my 20s. And I knew I wanted to write a story about this white senator from Georgia who falls in love with this black woman restaurant owner in Washington, D.C. But I'm very fortunate that no one was interested in that book because I didn't know what I was doing. I was putting words on a page, and that was just about it. But as time has evolved and I've had a chance to really live with these characters, I realized that I wanted two strong characters who had everything to lose by being in this relationship. And I also knew I wanted to explore the politics of 1948, probably one of the most contentious elections that we've had up until here recently, but it was the time in which the Democrats from the South split from the Democratic Party because Truman was getting a little bit too cozy with the people who were fighting for civil rights for Black people. And so my main character, she's very active in working with Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and some of the others that were active in civil rights during that time. So I'm thankful that no one wanted the book when I was in my 20s, because I think arriving into my 50s was where I needed to be in order for this book to really make sense and to have the depth that I wanted it to have, but didn't know how to do as a 20-something. No offense to you 20-somethings who are very smart and can write. I just wasn't there yet.
I mean, we would have thought you were still in your 20s if you hadn't told us.
Come on, girl.
Lee, you had the surreal experience of having your debut novel chosen by the Read with Jenna book club. On the Today Show, Jenna said, "In a time when our country does seem so divided, I felt like it would be a healing, beautiful book for so many to read." And you're tackling these issues of class and politics, but you also have this story of young love and coming into one's own as a writer. What do you think it is about groundskeeping that seems to resonate so broadly in such a universal way?
Well, I think that, I sort of realized halfway through that if I was going to set a novel in 2016 that I was going to have to write about the election. So it was kind of like this oh crap moment, like, oh, I've started writing this book and it's set in 2016, so I'm going to have to talk about politics in some way. But I think, I was interested in writing a book about two people who are coming from really different backgrounds, who, have a lot of obstacles, but still decide to try to make it work anyway. And there was just something really interesting to me about not only the kind of political arguments and tensions going on within families, but between friends or lovers who came from really different family backgrounds or had families with really different political beliefs. So I guess it was kind of, me saying, what can I put these characters through? What can I make them deal with on the page, and how can they kind of work through these issues? Yeah.
And for me, in writing The Next Thing You Know, I think it's a very different book from all three of these. I've always been a sucker for stories about people who start out as strangers and end up in a really short amount of time having a huge impact on each other's lives. And I think I like those stories so much because they leave you with this sense of possibility, that you just never know what might happen the next day or who you might meet who could change your whole life forever. So I hope this is one of those stories. So it's about the chemistry between these two people. We have our protagonist, Nova, who has recently baffled her family and friends by walking away from everything familiar in her life, her job, her boyfriend, her home, and deciding to train to become an end-of-life doula, which, if you don't know what that is, it's kind of like a midwife or a birth doula at the other end of life. So if someone has gotten a difficult diagnosis or they're facing the end of their life, she would help them through that transition in a holistic, non-medical way, however, whatever that means to her clients. And her family is like, why would you want to do that? That sounds so morbid and terrible to us. Why would you want to do this? But she has her own reasons that she kind of keeps to herself. And one day she opens her door. Most of her clients are older, or they've been through years and years. They show up at her door after years and years of cancer treatments, looking terrible. She opens her door, and there's this sort of young guy who rolls up smelling like a bonfire in a dirty Jeep, and kind of looks like a fallen rock star, and he is. He's like a cult favorite indie musician who's fallen off the scene, and nobody knows where he went or why, but he's at her door, and he has a degenerative condition where he's physically losing the ability to play his guitar, and doesn't really know what to do with himself. And he's like, I heard you can help me make peace with the end of life as I know it. And he's not really very open to the experience, and yet he hires her as his doula. So it's kind of about the relationship that evolves between the two of them and what happens from there. So let's talk about the role of setting as a backdrop to all of your stories, and especially for the connection, the love, but maybe also the conflict between your characters. Angela and Gwenda, you both have characters navigating landscapes that are charged with a lot of external forces. So, Angela, you have largely segregated Washington, D.C., 1947, 48. Gwenda's character is literally coming and going from hell through via escape room. Can you speak to why you chose your setting and how it influences the interplay between your characters?
You go first.
Well, you know, I knew that if I was going to write about politics, the story had to be in Washington, D.C. There was just no way around it. And the interesting thing about writing historical fiction is that you can go in with a very specific idea of how your story is going to look, but then you'll find these little nuggets that really add to the overall, I guess, the landscape of what I was writing. And I found out about this historic part of DC called U Street. And U Street was considered the hub of theater and restaurants, and there were over 300 businesses owned by black people in 1938 on U Street, the most populated street in the country for black businesses outside of maybe Harlem. And so to be able to find that and realize that I can build on that in my story, it became almost like another character. Because all of the things happening on U Street really motivated my main character to want to become a business owner herself and to become more involved in local politics, which ultimately ended up being national politics. So a setting is always going to be another character in my novels. At least it has been so far.
I'm curious how much research was involved in bringing that to life, because you have a lot of real life figures in your book too. I mean, even at the opening New Year's Eve party, Langston Hughes is there, Josephine Baker is there. How much research was involved?
Y'all don't even want to know. I try to give it the gestation of 9 months, so about the equivalent of carrying a baby. I spend about that much time researching my novels before I write them. But something as simple as Frank Sinatra was at that party that she was describing. So I had to find out, where was Frank Sinatra on New Year's Eve, 1947? Because I didn't want some historian to say, well, Frank couldn't have been at that party, because he was. So I went through my entire guest list, and I did the detailed work of finding out where all of them were. And it was fun because I like that process, but it is tedious.
Okay, so Gwenda, you're at the total opposite end of the
Well,
spectrum.
I think a lot of people would deny that Washington, D.C. and hell are that far apart. Certainly at the moment. You know, actually, hilariously enough, I actually did a lot of research on the history of hell because I wanted mine to be both unique and borrow from the traditions. And there's a great book called The History of Hell, written by Alice K. Turner, who was a very influential fiction editor at Playboy, and I had lunch with once, who also wrote this very well-researched book about the way depictions and perceptions of hell have changed over the centuries. And it's fascinating stuff, but, you know, I'm just like a hashtag nerd, so I'm always going to read. But a lot of the occult stuff in the book, everything in the book, occult-wise, except even the demons that seem outlandish are all things pulled from real, like, sort of historical occult works. And so the part I was inventing was the escape room. And it was based, the whole book was inspired on taking a bunch of authors to an escape room in Murfreesboro at a conference like this.
Some people also think that is hell, by the way.
Some people always think that's hell. It was really fun because it was a great group and we escaped. And there was it was clearly a family business. There was a dog behind the counter, and I came up with the idea for Not Your Average Hot Guy on the way home. Didn't tell my agent. When I did tell my agent, she was like, write the whole thing. And then I found out later that's because she hates books like this about demons and stuff, although she ended up liking this book. But it's like, you could have just told me you hate this kind of book. And that's why you're making me write the whole thing.
So Lee, we both wrote stories where a character comes home again, kind of back to their roots. Yours to Kentucky, mine to Ohio, which I think in both our cases goes on to play really heavily into the dynamics that follow. Can you speak to the many roles of setting and groundskeeping and your process behind some of the specific choices you made?
Sure. Well, I think it's kind of my default setting that when I start on any piece of writing, at least some part of it's probably going to be set in Kentucky. And I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, the characters in the book, I think Owen and Alma are sort of coming toward each other and almost passing each other, going in opposite directions, because Owen is trying to leave Kentucky and Alma is coming from outside and growing to love it and wants to stay. And so that's also kind of creating tension in their relationship. But yeah, I mean, the first line of the book kind of says it all for me. I was sort of, you know, I stuck around after grad school to teach for a year, and I was really trying to write a novel because I kept talking to agents about short stories, and I would, you know, see their eyes glaze over, and they'd look at their watches and wonder how long the meeting was going to last. So I was like, well, I guess I better write a novel. And so I just racked my brain trying to think of what kind of emotional question could sustain me over the course of writing a novel, which I knew could take a long time. What is the problem, the perennial problem that keeps coming up in my life? And what it was for me is sort of just the first line of the book, that when I'm home, I want to leave, and when I'm away, I'm homesick. And so it's just this constant kind of predicament, and that's sort of the situation that Owen is in the book. And Kentucky is a place that he knows deeply and that he loves, but he also has sort of complex feelings about it, as I think, you know, a lot of people do about where they're from. Yeah.
And you chose some real cities, but made a fictional college campus.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's interesting because the trick with like placing a fictional place in the real world is that you are going to have people that come to you and like, well, I live here, and this thing doesn't exist. Like, there's not a college here. And it's like, yes, I know, it's fiction. I made it up. It doesn't exist. But yeah, so I don't know. I just didn't want to use a college setting that I was familiar with. I wanted to create something new that was sort of not quite in the city, that was a little bit further out. But I wanted it to be close enough to Louisville that the characters could go there and spend a lot of time there. So I was like, that college doesn't exactly exist, so I need to make it up.
I think it's interesting. I don't know if Cincinnati is all that different from Kentucky, but my main character, the musician, when he is away, he is not homesick. He is very happy to be away, living his, you know, whether he's sleeping on couches, sleeping in his Jeep, just going from music festival to music festival. You know, he's never the guy on the main stage. He's on like the side stage, just getting by. He's okay with that. But he loves that lifestyle. People are always saying to him, like, that must be so hard. Don't you miss being grounded in a certain place? And he's like, no, this is what I thrive on. This is what I love. But he physically can't do it anymore. And, you know, in the absence of income, really has no choice but to go home. He has to have a bunch of surgeries. You know, he's a musician. He doesn't really have health insurance. He's basically living back in his teenage bedroom, and he doesn't even bother to redecorate the bedroom. Like, all his terrible posters from high school are on the walls, and he just hates it. So he's very much there against his will. And when he shows up, I mean, his family is glad that he's back, but they're frustrated because they know he's not glad that he's back. And when he shows up at the door of this end-of-life doula, you know, they don't seem like they have that much in common at first, but she's kind of at this similar point in her life where she's gone on this sort of, you know, midlife crisis kind of early in her life, gone off, done all these things that her family doesn't understand or want her to do, and kind of their compromise is that she's come home. She's really kind of buckled to them wanting her to come home. Fine, if you insist on not going back to this great job you had and this great guy you had, and if you insist on doing this doula thing, could you at least come back and be close to us and do it at home? So I think part of what brings them to each other at the beginning is this mutual, like, unsatisfaction sense that they both have of being kind of just trapped somewhere that they don't want to be, and they can kind of lean on each other and help each other through it. So circling back to our love is complicated theme, I'm curious, as the bond began to grow between your characters, which aspects of the relationship came the most naturally on the page, and which were the ones where the parts of the dynamic that you found yourself just tweaking again and again, trying to get right? Angela, I'd imagine yours is, I mean, they were so different from the start.
Yes, I decided I was going to tackle writing a novel with 2 points of view. One was a black woman who's basically of wealth, but here's the complicated one. I also decided to write from the voice of a white male from the South in 1948. As you can tell, these are all things I would know firsthand. So it was a difficult process to try to get into his head and try to think how I would think he would, how he would process things in that time. So it was complicated in terms of neither one of those characters really resonate in me in terms of my life, but it was fun to be able to do the research and to reach out to people that I knew who could tell me if I was going down the wrong road. I tell my students, it's not about choosing stories that mirror your life, but it's about choosing people to be in your life to help you, give you guidance on the direction you're taking your story. So I had a lot of beta readers, people who gave me insight when I was, taking him down a road that he probably wouldn't have gone down.
Interesting. Gwenda, what about you?
Callie and Luke both emerged pretty fully formed, and I think we can all relate to, we might not relate to being like the Prince of Hell, but I also wanted to kind of unpack the toxic masculinity and do like kind of a cinnamon roll version of that, because I don't actually find bad boys appealing. And so it's a lot about his relationship with his dad, right? He's kind of a disappointment. And so it's about these two characters in their 20s figuring out who they want to be in relation to their families and their lives. And for Callie, she has always kind of avoided adventure, and she literally designs adventures for other people. And she has to kind of step up and embrace one herself and learn things about each other. And so she also is not into bad boys. So I think a lot of the fun of two characters that are thrown together who appear to be opposites at first, but are actually going through very similar things is something that romance does really well. And obviously there's a lot of fun banter and tension and hijinks and twists you can get out of that kind of odd couple on the road together, trying to save the world.
Lee, what about you?
I think the aspect of the relationship between Owen and Alma that I thought about most, and that I probably also had to tweak the most, was just the class difference between them. And I don't know, I was just from the beginning, I wanted to write a novel about class because for me, it seems like class has disappeared largely from contemporary fiction, whereas 19th century fiction was completely obsessed with class. I mean, Thomas Hardy, Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, they were all writing about these relationships where the primary hurdle was often class, a class difference. So when Pip meets Estella in Great Expectations, he's not aware that he's the son of a common blacksmith until she tells him, right? She says, "You have common boots." And she asks him, they're playing cards, and she asks him, "Why do you call jacks knaves?" And so I wanted there to be little moments of, I don't know if they're quite like microaggressions, but these little moments of like inadvertent classism in this relationship that create tension. I mean, and this is just another kind of stumbling block. I mean, it's interesting because a romantic relationship, if everything was easy, then no one would want to read a book about it, right? There have to be difficulties, there have to be problems. And I think class was just something that I wanted to really set up as a major obstacle for these two people to kind of work through. Yeah.
And I think in my case with Mesa and Nova, the hardest thing about their relationship for me as the author and for them is that it obviously has a very finite amount of time to happen. I mean, if you're hiring an end-of-life doula because of your diagnosis, you know, neither of you are going into this expecting this to be a very long relationship. It might be an important relationship, but, you know, I think part of the reason I wanted to write about an end-of-life doula, the more I learned about what they do, was because I thought it would take a really special person to do that job and to sit with people in those moments. At the same time, you know, I think you would be guarded and not want to probably open yourself to that person very much, but then at the same time, to be good at your job, you might have to do that. So trying to figure out, and same with him, so realistically, how much are either of you even going to be open to getting close to somebody else at this stage of your life was probably the thing that was the hardest to get right in that case. And I noticed in all 4 of our books, when it comes to the main characters and their friends or their family or their colleagues, all of the core relationships in our book were either secret or frowned upon, at least at one point in the story. So can you each speak a little more to that dynamic again and how it added tension and conflict for your characters to have this external pressure of knowing that there's disapproval around them?
I'll talk about my character, Cortland. As I mentioned earlier, he was a senator from Georgia and was a member of a family who had previously owned slaves. His grandfather was a slave owner. His mother only knew plantation life. His father is, I sort of modeled him after the Kennedy patriarch who, you know, Joe Kennedy, who really pushed his sons to go into politics. So I wanted kind of the Southern version of that. And so Cortland struggles in a lot of ways because he sees the injustices that are taking place, but he also very much wants to make a name for himself in politics. So it's a really kind of fragile path that he's walking in terms of how much he can push against things that we would take for granted as things you should push against. So one of his closest friends is actually a real person, member of the House of Representatives, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. If you ever get a chance to read about him, probably one of the most fascinating, corrupt, but also genuine when it came to fighting for civil rights. So he was sort of like the voice of reason, pushing Cortland, saying you can't have it both ways. You can't say there are unjust laws, but at the same time build your career on those unjust laws. So he really grapples a lot with trying to figure out how does one become a senator with morals and values while also making the effort to eventually move into the presidency, which was the goal his father had for him. So I'm able to allow him to interact with a lot of political people that you'd recognize if you were into reading about 1948 politics. Strom Thurmond also enters into the picture. He was a great one to research. He has a black daughter named Essie Washington. If you've not read her book, it's a page turner. So I love politics, and to be able to marry my love of politics with this love story, it was really, it was a perfect storm for fun writing.
So the thing about Callie and Luke, my main characters, is that they are literally from 2 different worlds. And so I was lucky in usually romances, you don't follow the same characters over more than one book, but my editor wanted me to do a sequel to give the characters more time together. And so the second book became a lot more about negotiating how their lives actually might fit together. Which was a fun thing to get to do. It also allowed me to expand the world building and create some new settings, and just to hopefully like enrich the mythology of the world. But that core conflict of, you know, how do you make your life work when you're with someone who is going in a completely different direction than you, and also exploring what it's like to be a human, and in the books, what it's like to be a demon or a guardian or all those fun things. I mean, again, these books are just like were play for me and were kind of my escape during the pandemic. So they're also very globe hoppy. So all of that stuff, I think, is just big fun and not capital I important like what you're writing. But is a nice escape. I mean, one thing we've learned, right? You need all kinds of books. And I mean, I think the great thing about this panel and the diversity of people on it is it shows how love stories can be centered in any kind of fiction in an interesting way.
Well, I mean, obviously, you know, and it's always interesting when characters come from really different family backgrounds. You know, whether that's the Montagues or the Capulets or, you know, whatever. It's always an interesting dynamic. But I think what interested me specifically for Owen and Alma was that, you know, I think there's a tendency, say, on the right wing, to sort of have reductive opinions about a group of people, for example, immigrants. But then to actually meet someone coming from that background, it's like your reductive expectations don't quite match up with reality, right? And so Alma in the book is coming from a family of Bosnian immigrants. They were refugees coming to the U.S. And I think the counterpoint is also true. I think people on the left can have sometimes reductive opinions about people living in rural places or conservatives or whatever. And people are always more complicated than our reductive opinions about them. I mean, they're always going to surprise you and subvert your expectations, you know. And so, I don't know, I saw their relationship as almost a way of, almost like running an experiment, right? Like what would happen if the son of Trump supporters gets together with the son or with the daughter of refugees, and kind of what kind of electricity will that make? You know, what kind of tension will that create? Yeah, I think that's how I kind of approached it.
And Gwenda, I wanted to ask you, at the lighter end of the spectrum, humor plays a huge role in the success of any romantic comedy. Even your titles are funny. And I have a good friend who's a stand-up comic, and I think humor is one of those things that looks deceptively simple, when it really is one of the hardest craft tricks to pull off, especially on the page where you can't read it in front of an audience and see if they laugh or not, and then revise it for the next night, you know? So do you have any litmus tests or go-to methods for hitting that sweet spot?
Well, I do think you're right that it's very difficult. And I also think, like, if you're going to be funny, you have to be vulnerable in a different way. It's one thing if people don't like your book, but it's another thing if they don't like your sense of humor.
Yeah.
It feels more personal somehow. You know, I think there's a lot of my voice in here, so it's not going to be for everyone. And I don't think there really can be a... I mean, obviously, if you crack yourself up, like, you know, you're doing something right. But you know, a lot of that is also in editorial reactions, I think, because you just kind of have to feel it out. But I will say that sustaining humor over a novel is very difficult, much more so than, I mean, like when people say this is this is a fun read, oh, it's, you know, super quick. That's like the best compliment you could give, because I know how painstaking like all of the tonal shifts and that stuff can be. But it's fun. It is a fun challenge, and I write all sorts of different things because I get bored easily. And sometimes when I'm writing a funny book, I'm like, why am I doing this? It would be so much easier to make it serious. For me, it actually is easier to write non-comic fiction. Anyway.
I think even in a heavy book, there is a really important role that humor can play. I know in the next thing you know, I knew this was a heavy topic. We have a character doing a heavy thing. I knew comic relief of some sort was going
have to have it, right?
Have to happen in this story. And also, I didn't want the story to be...
You didn't want it to feel like The Road?
No. I mean... My publisher was billing it as Me Before You meets A Star Is Born. I'm like, that's not too far off the mark, but at the same time, I really don't think it's a story about someone who finds out he's dying. I think it's a story about learning to live every life to the fullest. And that was one of the things I learned in researching end-of-life doulas, is that they have this great outlook on, they've seen all the regrets people have at the end, and they have this really great outlook, and they often think, wouldn't it be great if we all had this outlook? It's kind of a lot of pressure to put on yourself, like, I'm gonna live every day like this might be my last day, and it sounds really cliche, but it's actually a really amazing attitude to have if you can figure out how to master that. So I had a character who I added for exactly that reason. Her name is Glenna. And, for Nova, if Mason is this client who really doesn't want to be there, and he's like, I heard you can help me, but I don't think you really can, but I don't know what else to do with my time, so here I am. And she's like, where do I go from this? Glenna is this sunny older woman who's got this bad diagnosis, but she's just bought in. She really just wants someone to, smoke her medicinal weed with her and eat Doritos and drink bourbon. That's really all she wants to do with her time left. So... but also you don't want to seem insensitive when you're putting in scenes like that. So I also found it tricky to get right, but I was so glad I added her because it seemed like that was the character who people would always say, Glenna was my favorite. Glenna was my favorite character. I was so glad she was in there. I think it's time to open to questions from the audience.
Absolutely. If anybody has a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you so everybody can hear. So don't be shy. Anybody's got a question? I'll also let you guys continue the conversation until we get the first question.
Okay.
So we'll just work it that way.
You have to ask questions, or
You
we'll
have to
start
ask-
asking you questions.
That's right.
Why aren't you at Barbara Kingsolver? What's wrong with you people?
I know. Did you know Barbara Kingsolver is also on a different stage right now? I did have one more question for Angela and Lee that I didn't get to. I was curious. You've both published these books that thoughtfully hold a mirror up to some hot button issues that we're facing. This isn't a question about crafting those titles, but publishing them. I'm curious what the experience has been like for you now that these books are out in the world. I would imagine there would be really rewarding moments where you can see your story spurring these meaningful discussions that you hoped might happen. Maybe also some more challenging moments that can get uncomfortable. I'm curious what the experience has been like for you.
It's a little bit surreal because I'm a little country girl from Alabama. I'm sort of taught to kind of downplay oneself. So it is a little bit interesting to have people come to you and say, I read your book. And I'm like, oh, why are they talking to me?
Don't perceive me.
Right, why are you talking to me? So it has taken a little bit of effort. It's also interesting because we live in a world now where social media is such that you can reach out to your favorite or maybe your not so favorite authors. And I've had people who, like one woman emailed me and said, well, I don't like that ending, and this is how I thought you should have ended it. And she just kind of gave me an alternate ending to the book. And I'm like, well, thank you. Nothing I can do about it at this point. So you really do have to kind of develop a thick skin because you never know if it's going to be praise or if it's going to be writing is not for you, woman. You need to pick another career. You don't know what you're going to get, so you just have to, smile. Just smile.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that it's been surreal because I feel like I'll get these questions that are like, what's your opinion about the state of America at the moment? And I'm just like, I don't know. Like, I just wrote a book, you know. But it is interesting because I think the reception to groundskeeping has been, I think people have assumed on some level that maybe it's a call to moderation or a call for people to sort of move to the center. And that's been a little strange for me because I feel firmly to the left. And I don't think that that was the gist that I hoped the book would have. If anything, I think I hoped that it would maybe, you know, urge people to move past sort of the theater of politics or, you know, just kind of that superficial level or something, and to think more about kind of the way that it's working really concretely in people's lives.
God, if only.
Yeah, if only. But yeah, so it has been strange though, definitely.
I'm going to ask you guys a question, and then I'm going to come up here at the front. If you were not an author, what would you do for a living?
Wait, I have a question for Jess first, which is, do you get people contacting you who are dying to tell you their stories? Because I know other authors who write about like very real issues like that who get those emails.
I've actually gotten a lot of emails from end-of-life doulas, which has been
Wow.
interesting. Not from people who are dying necessarily, but one of the first things that happened when my book was published, there were a few things that happened in a row. There was a Time magazine cover story on end-of-life doulas the month before my book came out
Nice
in March.
planning on your part.
Partially because the demand for them during the pandemic, which the pandemic, I was halfway through writing this book before the pandemic even began, but the pandemic increased demand a lot because people suddenly realized the importance of, we had all these horrible stories of people stuck in quarantine and their families couldn't get to them, and people suddenly realized the importance of having somebody else with you and having someone to advocate for the things that you want. So there was this big cover story, and then People magazine put the book in People magazine, and Prince William was on the cover, so I'm pretty sure I'm like 1 degree apart from Prince William.
Totally
now,
are.
Just to be,
You might even be in the line of succession now.
and then I guess in People magazine, a woman who runs an end-of-life doula training association had seen the novel. And so she reached out to my publicist and asked, can I excerpt the novel in this newsletter to like 20,000 training doulas? And she hadn't read the novel. So I was like, this is great. FYI, my doula is a little bit of a wild card. I mean, my doula is like riding around on a motorcycle with no helmet, smoking weed with her clients. Like, she'll do anything they want her to do. Like, she's a little unorthodox, but she means well. And they were like, we understand creative license, it's all good. But it made me my initial reaction was I was nervous. But because she excerpted it, I think a lot of doulas have ended up reading it, and I hear from them. And honest to God, has only been positive feedback. So I've been very grateful. I think they're just grateful for anything that raises awareness that even exists, because so many people don't know that it does.
Okay, I have a better question from this nice person in front of me than the one I threw your way. So here we go.
Yes, hello. I want to piggyback on what Lee was talking about a little bit earlier. I'm just curious, how do you feel when people don't interpret your book the way you expect them to? Not even that they don't like it, but they just don't understand everything. Maybe, does it make you feel like, well, I kind of missed the mark a little bit? Maybe there's something else I should have included so that they could kind of go in this direction versus that direction?
I mean, my first question is, did they buy it? If so, we're cool. You guys have a real answer.
Well, you know, because my books are all historical, I do worry from historians or people who follow that particular time period, because I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to. It's an honor when a historian reads something that I've written and they say that was spot on. So I do have those folks in my ear. When it comes to just the basic plot of the story, you're either gonna like the characters or you don't, and if you don't, that's okay. Read the next book. Maybe you'll like them.
I always try to leave my endings a little, certain aspects of them, a little open to interpretation. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think whatever the reader is bringing to the book, I'm very reluctant. Whatever you got out of the book, then that's what you got out of the book. I would never say that's wrong. And I actually visit with a lot of book clubs, and very often they'll try to pin me down on like, okay, but like after the last chapter, now what do you think happened between? And I'm like, I refuse to answer. That's not for me to say. Whatever you want to imagine happened after the last page is for you too. So for me, I'm okay with leaving what I said on the page and with anyone taking from it what they want to take from it.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, basically. I mean, people are going to project whatever is going on in their life onto your book. And that's a good thing. That's what makes it literature. You know, that's what books are for, right? It's that you can identify in some way, and if they weren't open to interpretation, then it would just be an essay. It would just be a writer sort of spoon-feeding you, a position or something, right? So I think it's a good thing that they can be open,
Yeah, I mean, reading is a collaborative activity, right?
We have 2 more questions. The first one's right here.
All right, this is a question about process. When you're writing a piece and you don't really know where it's going, to what extent do you outline and like sort of hammer out all the details, and to what extent do you just orient yourself in a direction and stream of consciousness just kind of dump on the page and then find the voice as you're going?
I now outline a lot because I had to learn how to outline to do intellectual property work, because I did a Lois Lane series for DC Comics, and then I did the Stranger Things book. And for books like that, they want to know exactly what you're going to do, but you also want them to know what you're going to do, because that avoids the nightmare scenario where you turn in something that they are like, nuh-uh. Like, I think the comment on the Lois Lane books, like, actually, they wrote actually, the guy loved the book, but there was, like, one note when he sent back the manuscript, and it was like, Superman cannot do anything illegal. And I'm like, we could debate. Like, a lot of things he does do are illegal, but,
Okay.
Anyone else?
I think we've got time for this last question. All right,
No,
here we
you
go.
guys should have answered that.
I know. That's all good.
You go down and buy their books and ask them.
What's up next for each of you? Future projects.
Future projects. What's going on?
You want to go first?
I actually can't talk about my new project yet, but I've just turned it in, and I'm moving to a new publisher, and I think it'll be out late next year, and it's a swing a little bit back toward the suspense space for me, but that's all I can say about it so far.
I am. I just submitted a manuscript to my publisher. That book's coming out next October. It is still in the Parsons, Georgia universe that my last 2 books have been in. And I'm also researching and hopefully writing about a lynching that took place in Marion, Indiana. Hopefully that book will come out in the next 2 years.
All right, I'm going to do these real quick. The next novel is out in March, is Mr. and Mrs. Witch, is another rom-com unrelated to these 2, a standalone. I'm also working with a new publisher on a heist novel called The Frame Up that's set in Kentucky in a fictional art collection. And I have a Audible original series with my friends Cami Garcia and Sam Humphreys, where they'll be releasing 3 novellas at some point next year called The Young Bloods.
Is that all?
No, there's more, but those are the ones I have like firm release dates for. I'm so behind.
I don't have anything concrete at the moment. I mean, I feel like it's not at the stage where I can talk about it without killing it, so I'm gonna just let it be.
We're out of time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Jessica.
Thank you.
We all will be downstairs at our tables if anyone would like to come by, ask a question we didn't touch on, get a book signed. I have free bookmarks. Some of you might have some swag as well, so Thank you all so much for coming. We appreciate it.